Professor Alexandr Naymark. He trained as an archaeologist and historian at Tashkent and Moscow universities. From 1983 to 91, Alexander worked at the Moscow Museum of Oriental Art, directing excavation projects in Central Asia, where he was actually born. In 1992, he enrolled at Indiana University Bloomington and was awarded a PhD in Central Eurasian Studies and Art History. He's an alumnus of the 1983 Summer Seminar of the American Numismatic Society, and subsequently was a Horstman Fellow at the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin. For the last 25 years, Alexander has been teaching at Hofstra University as a professor of art history and as the director of Middle Eastern and Central Asian program. He was the Oriental Numismatic Society's Ashoka Prize winner in 2022.
The question of trade in Eurasia, particularly fur trade. History started when Fren discovered the wealth of Kufic hoards in Russia and Eastern Europe, and his work was continued in Russia by a number of other people like Savelyev, and then Thyssen, all great names, and then eventually by Markov. These hoards, they probably contained, but by now, hundreds of hoards. This is a map actually created by Marek Yankoviak, and I'm assuming that it's not absolutely complete, even though it was done recently because they're new finds, and we rediscover old finds. This is probably over 1 million coins that have been discovered in these areas. And these are the heroes of our story: Fren, Savelyev, Thyssen, and then on the right, finally, Markov. The question was when all this huge trade started. Well, by 1930s, it became clear that through, by the way, the creation of corpus of words, mainly by Hofstra, and, well, that was done by previous generations, but it was summated and added by Hofstra and Nikolai Bauer in the Hermitage Museum. Both scholars of German descent, both were eventually executed by Soviet power. And they came up with a clear border, saying that it was the flow of Central Asian coins and in general Near Eastern coins in Eastern Europe started in the 9th century. A later date was slightly adjusted through the not so many finds of Abbasid and Umayyad dirhams. Then the work was continued by different people. One particular stepping stone was a work by Noonan, who in 1980 offered a general summary of this. Then this work was adjusted by himself. He published another article where he showed that there was already flow of Khwarezmian drachms of the 8th century into the Eastern Europe. And then it was further adjusted by Alexander Nikitin and Goldiner, who actually published more coins, Central Asian coins, particularly Bukhara Khuda drachms, from various burial sites in Kama area. Then I published an article in 2015 showing that there should be an adjustment, and that first there were Bukharan coins and Sogdian coins principally, and that started in the late 5th, early 6th century and continued to the early 8th, while Khwarezmian coins started moving in late 7th and then replaced completely Bukharan coins in the 8th century. So this was rather long historiography. But then there are the conclusions which were derived from the silver, because coins were not the only material that was brought to Eastern Europe from Central Asia. Particularly, there was a lot of silver in the form of vessels. And in fact, in Kama area, there are more vessels of Iranian origin and Central Asian origin found than in Iran or Central Asia itself, by far. This is the map of the finds. Well, the map once more reflects the state in early 70s. Since then, much have changed. Not totally, but there are much more material. And all this was eventually summarized by the great specialist on Oriental silver, Boris Marshak, who incidentally was also my teacher, who suggested that the flow started in the 4th century. In fact, majority of Sogdian vessels and Iranian vessels with Sogdian inscriptions, in fact, are coming in the 5th century. And that was the verdict which was kind of accepted in the literature widely. However, there were always some facts that were hanging outside of this conclusion. And these facts were first noticed and made into a theory by Frederick John Taggart, Well, he was a historian. He was Irish origin, but working eventually at Berkeley, where he created a um, um, cathedra for himself. And he was interested in general processes in history. That's not remembered very much because his ideas about engines ruling history is somewhat out of date now. But he is still remembered as a person who really seriously affected Toynbee. Toynbee was recognizing his influence as categorically most important in his career. This is all forgotten, but his book Rome and China is still holding some importance in its parts. And there he pointed out that there were two pieces of information in Chinese sources, one in Hohanshu, which actually says that there's some kingdom of Yan to the north of kingdom of Yansai, which is also called Alan Liao. And this kingdom of Yan is a dependency of Kanju. And it produces small pelts which it uses to pay tribute to Kanju. Then there's also a text written in the 3rd century, Veilue, and it says that the kingdom of Yan and kingdoms around it actually has large number of their famous sables. Well, as Yansai, or in the texts, or Yanchai and Yansai in the text, is not an ethnic group. This conclusion comes out of the fact that, for example, when Alans come to the historical scene, they become Alan Liao, equal Yansai. They are not a political entity as such, but rather a territory. It became clear that this is a territory to the north of Caspian Sea. It's actually eastern part of North Caspian steppes, or North Caspian depression. These people were the same, they're also called in Chinese sources at a certain point, Hapsu or Hapso, and that perfectly corresponds to what Plinius says about the inhabitants of these areas in his time, so that's 70s of the 1st century Anno Domini, that they're called Abzoi. It's clear that these people were receiving sables from the north, because, of course, sables are not found in the steppes. And that would lead us to Kama area, because the source of these sables could be only forest areas around Kama. And we know that historically, later, for example, all the furs are coming to places like Khwarezm and then further to the entire nearest from this area along Volga, along the Kama River, and then Volga River. Taggart suggested that this was a fur route, and since Chinese knew about this Yan only one thing about this sables, he assumed that that was a route which brought sables to China and furs in general, and he created an idea of fur route. Later, he was joined by Shiratori Kurakichi, who wrote two very important articles on Western countries in Chinese narratives, and then by scholars like Eugene Lyubelesnichenko, some European, some Chinese scholars, who actually promote the idea of fur route. However, there was an obstacle here, because Sarmatian archaeologists were very unhappy with this. Well, starting with early 90s. Earlier it was the problem, but in the early 90s it turned out that there is a discrepancy between the date of Chinese objects found in Sarmatian burials and the date of burials themselves. Chinese objects are all dated to the 2nd century BC, while they're found in the burials of the late 1st century BC, that is 100 years later, or even late 1st century Anno Domini, well, which would make 200 years later. As a result, they assumed that this was a result of migration, and that nomads, well, meaning all this Daiyueji and everybody who came with them, meaning Sakai and Wusong and later Xundu branches, they actually brought with them all these objects, and these were luxurious objects that were kept in the families, and they were slowly deposited on graves in the later period. Well, on the other hand, there was also an opinion that this is a trade. It's, first of all, supported by Ursula Broseder and some Chinese scholars. Nowadays, this discussion was still ongoing, but 2 years ago, actually, already, my schoolmate and nowadays a very famous specialist on imports in the steppe zone, Mikhail Treister, he published a very mighty article which summarized all the discussion and all the objects, whatever it was there, and came to a conclusion that there was no such thing as fur root. There are absolutely no grounds to speak about it. Whether it's true or not, we will see. But there is something that should be taken into consideration. Numismatic materials were practically not taking part in this discussion. That kind of a loss because somewhere quite far in the north, and I will show it with a cursor here, that is 10 kilometers south of Perm. Please note that it is incredibly far in the north. Well, it's practically on the level of Finland and St. Petersburg and so on, right? So that far on the north, on a site which is called Gledionova, finds of Kushan coins were made. Well, the site itself is very interesting. It's a cape between two rivers. The height of the cape is about 100 meters, and it served as a ritual site since at least 6th century BC. Already in the 6th century BC, there were fortifications, rather sophisticated, built there. Well, once more, it's remarkable, very far to the north, but that's not really what concerned us, because we are more interested in the period of the first centuries of our era, when on the site was formed a huge, what is called in Russian, kostische. In other words, a huge deposit of bones. Well, mostly animal, apparently bones. That is a sport. One main principal sport is no less than 100 feet in diameter and 5 to 6 feet thick. And these are just bones. Well, not just bones, because about 12,000 beads were found there, and several hundred of small bronze figurines, locally produced mostly, but also some other things. And the beads are largely from the Black Sea area. About 2/3 of them belong to those glass beads internally gilded inside. Obviously, that was the main product that was coming there from the Bosporus and colonies in the Black Sea area, Roman, actually, territories in the Black Sea area. Among the things, by the very first excavator already in 1897, they found coins. Well, the first excavator unfortunately died 2 years after excavations were done without publishing a report, although he left detailed papers and a draft report. His materials were published by famous Russian archaeologist Spitsyn. Well, they were extraordinary in many respects, but Spitsyn did not excavate it himself, and actually, there were problems with coins, apparently, because the information between what Spitsyn was writing and Krещёных was mentioning was significant. And then ultimately Teplauchov, a famous amateur archaeologist, published the reports of Krещёных with all details. Still, there were problems with coins. Well, coins were sent to State Hermitage and were identified by Markov. And ultimately, we know now the composition of the three finds, three coins. There were 2 coins of Kudjula Katfizis from southern Minsk, apparently with the name of Kudjula Katfizis, because otherwise in 1899 they would be identified. Markov certainly knew publications of Cunningham of 1890 and 1892. But then there was also one coin of what in Hermitage was identified as Sanabar. And although neither of the 3 coins were found, we can be quite sure that they were set, because there is a diary record by Teplauchov, who actually examined the coins in 1898 and left a note. His diary is preserved in Petersburg Academy of Sciences, and it was recovered by Lepechin and published. Well, Lepechin and his colleagues Melnichuk and Vichtomov actually started re-excavating the site in 1990s, and 2 more coins were recovered. One of them turned out to be a coin of Huvishka, and another one actually a Wuzhu by Guanwudi, and that was also quite remarkable. In addition to this, in 2015, two local collectors reported the finds of two more coins. One is what you see on the photograph. This is a coin with the name of Hermes, but minted under Kuchela Ephesus. And then there is this Kanishka with Khwarezmian S-shaped countermark on both sides. Finally, my dear colleague Natasha Smirnova of Pushkin Museum was preparing the catalog of Greco-Bactrian coins in the Hermitage Museum and found out that in 1851 a coin was found in the same area and was brought to Hermitage, and that coin was imitation of Euthydemus. Unfortunately, not possible to identify it in the collection of the Hermitage Museum because the record was lost when it was just placed in some kind of case number 7. Whatever it is, all these coins, there are 8 identifiable and 1 more silver coin not identifiable, are coming from a very compact area, which is called the area of Gledionova culture, which in the first centuries of our era greatly developed. That is really the map of the sites of this culture made by Pereskokov, an archaeologist from Perm University. The list of coins looks like this. They all belong to the period between the second quarter of the first century Anno Domini and the first third of the third century Anno Domini. These are 4 which are recorded, well, which are physically existing. Others we know only by descriptions. But altogether, that is quite a record. Nowhere in Eastern Europe we have anything like this remotely until the 5th century Anno Domini. Well, some conclusions that can be derived from this can be as follows. Out of 9 coins that are found there, 7 are copper. Since this copper and hardly presentable coins could not be an evidence of long-distance transfer of any precious goods, and this is just a direct contact. So it appears that the merchants from Parthian, Iran, Kushan Empire, and Central Asia, and Central Asia is recorded by Euthydemus' imitation of Bukhara, and also probably by Wuju, because Wuju commonly found in Fergana burials. We know over 22 early Wuju, mostly, however, of Western Han, which are firmly recorded, probably more by now. We can assume that these were merchants which were going through territories of Sogd and Kanju, Kangui, and we can assume that this was fur because no other reason to go that far to the north when the distance from Bukhara to Perm is 3,000 kilometers. Taking a daily trip of a caravan at about 30 kilometers, and that is an average marhala in Arabic, for example, sources, we can assume that the trip would take 100 days. So starting somewhere in March, you could probably come back in early November. That was quite a remarkable journey. But we can assume that that was more or less permanent activity because we see separate coins which could not be, as I already said, treasures or particularly valuable objects in this area. And then reaching territories of Kangui and Sogdiana, they went their own ways to China, to India, and to Iran. Well, I don't know if it is a fur route, but it's certainly a fur trade. And it's a trade which has multi-vectoral character. In other words, it goes into different directions. That is the real picture which emerges from numismatic materials. I only can hope that in the future, the beads of Central Asian and Near Eastern and Indian origin, which are apparently also found in some numbers on Gledionova side and other sites, will be analyzed and will produce additional evidence to what I'm saying right now. That would seem absolutely crazy if there was some other materials confirming this. And some other materials is that this route partially, at least in the part from North Caspian Depression to Central Asia, is coinciding with the route to the Black Sea area from Central Asia. And that is documented, for example, by Mujium hoard of Roman coins, which includes coins from the time of Vespasianus, to Commodus, and perfectly corresponds in composition to the Roman hoards of denarii found in Eastern Europe. The hoard was found in Mujium, in Central Asia, in a village which is standing by a narrow passage from Fergana to Upper Austrushana, that is basically northwestern Sogd. The man who published it was Eugen Zemel, and he was the first also to suggest that there was a direct connection on the northern route between Central Asia and Black Sea area. Well, with this, I would like to conclude. Thank you.